Reed Calloway came back to find his home reduced to dust beneath the treads of a demolition machine. Billionaire Dorian Blackwell stood before a model of his $4 billion waterfront development, holding a contract bearing Reed's signature and telling the world the man had sold his land for $1. Reed had never signed it. When he dug through the broken foundation with his bare hands, he found the small iron safe his late wife had told him never to open unless the house was threatened. Inside was a single envelope and a phone number. 3 days later, the FBI surrounded Blackwell Tower. If you believe one ordinary man can stand against that kind of power, stay with Reed until the end. The Crown Harbor development was introduced to the people of Ravenport, Maryland, as the project that would reshape the city's waterfront forever. A $4 billion complex of luxury hotels, a casino, a financial center, and a private marina stretching along the city's tidal edge, backed by Dorian Blackwell and the full institutional weight of Blackwell Dominion Group. For 3 years before the groundbreaking announcement, the project's acquisition arm had been moving quietly across the Briar Road district, absorbing parcels through a rotating series of limited liability companies with names that suggested civic improvement but traced back to a single corporate address. By the time Crown Harbor appeared on the front page of every Ravenport newspaper, nearly every house on Briar Row had been cleared, the lots graded and fenced, the families dispersed to rental units and satellite communities far from the waterfront. Only one structure remained, a 2-story brick house at the far end of the block, narrow and worn and still belonging to the same family that had built it 3 generations before. That house was Reed Calloway's. Reed was 44 years old, a carpenter and historic restoration contractor who earned a steady living reading the structural logic of old buildings, finding the load paths, preserving the joinery, recovering what other contractors declared a total loss. He had raised his daughter June alone in that house since his wife Audrey died 6 years earlier after a long illness, working in the same rooms she had spent a decade restoring by hand, stripping paint and repointing brick and relaying original oak floors in the hours between her treatments. When the first acquisition offer arrived by certified mail, Reed read through the appraisal documents, compared them against the county land records, noted that $450,000 was less than 60% of the lot's actual market value, and sent a written refusal. He was not opposed to negotiation, but he was not prepared to accept a figure that discounted what the land was actually worth or what it meant to hold. Dorian Blackwell handled the refusal in 2 registers, one public, one private. Before the cameras at a carefully arranged visit to Briar Row, Dorian presented himself as a developer with genuine respect for the neighborhood's history, shaking Reed's hand in front of a bank of journalists and characterizing the meeting as a dialogue between a visionary project and a proud community member. Privately, as the press contingent shifted positions and the microphone swung toward another shot, Dorian leaned toward Reed and said, without particular emotion, that when a city decided to move forward, a single house could not stand in the way forever. That evening, 2 city utility workers arrived at Briar Row, citing a reported gas leak near the property, and within 40 minutes, Gavin Lockridge, Blackwell Dominion's director of land acquisition, appeared at Reed's door with a clipboard, a measured explanation, and a set of papers described as standard safety and relocation documents. Gavin told Reed that the printer in the field office had malfunctioned and separated the signature page from the main body of the form, an inconvenience, he said, that happened with older city document templates, and Reed reading through the pages presented to him and finding nothing alarming in language about temporary displacement and structural inspection, signed where indicated and was transported to a hotel nearly an hour away. At 4:57 the following morning, his neighbor called to say that heavy equipment had entered the block. Reed drove back through the dark and arrived to find a demolition crew already working the foundation. Dust rising over the brick walls, Audrey had repointed by hand. The oak floors already broken beneath machinery that had no authorization he had ever approved. Dorian Blackwell stood at the construction fence with a recorded contract and a press contingent, telling the city that Reed had voluntarily sold his property the previous evening for a nominal consideration of $1. Mara Ellison, an attorney who ran a small community legal practice on the far side of Ravenport, pulled the filed contract from the county database on her phone and laid it beside the documents Reed had signed the night before. Both sets of papers carried the same reference code and the same timestamp, but where Reed's copy described a temporary relocation agreement, the recorded version described a permanent deed transfer signed in full legal form, with completely different operative language between the cover page and the signature line. The notary certification named a public official whose seal had been reported stolen 6 months prior, and who lived more than 300 miles from Ravenport, with no record of travel to the city on the relevant date. The demolition had begun at 5:12 in the morning. The contract had been recorded with the county clerk at 6:17. Reed walked to the edge of the site and told the demolition foreman to stop the machines, but the crew chief produced a copy of the recorded deed and a work order signed by the city's emergency demolition authority, and the police officer standing at the perimeter told Reed the matter was civil rather than criminal, and suggested he retain counsel. Dorian Blackwell, still at the fence, informed the journalists that Reed Calloway had sold the property to address outstanding debts and was now attempting to reverse the transaction after learning the full scope of the development's value, a narrative delivered with the unbroken calm of a man who had prepared it in advance. Reed said nothing to the cameras, stood at the fence, and watched the house come down. The chimney Audrey had rebuilt falling in a single piece. The front door he had planed and fitted himself carried away on the arm of a machine that did not know what it was holding. Mara showed Reed the two contracts side by side at a folding table in the back of her car. The pages were identical in formatting, reference code, and the shape of Reed's signature, but the operative language, the description of property rights, the consideration amount, the transfer terms, was entirely different between the version Reed had been handed and the version filed with the county. The signature page he had actually signed had been physically detached from the document it was presented with, and reattached to a deed transfer he had never read or agreed to, and the execution had been certified by a notary who confirmed by phone that she had not been in Maryland on the date in question, and that her official stamp had gone missing from her Virginia office 6 months before the transaction was recorded. Blackwell's communications office released a statement that afternoon describing Reed as a seller who had entered a voluntary agreement and was now seeking to exploit public sympathy after the project's scale became clear. Accounts associated with Reed's name and address appeared in news coverage citing unspecified financial difficulties and a man who had changed his mind when he understood the land's development value. Reed had no institutional platform to answer through, no legal team on retainer, no relationship with the kind of power that could match the velocity of Blackwell's communications apparatus. He had his truck, his tools, and a neighbor's borrowed jacket over the clothes he had been wearing when the call came at dawn. When the demolition crew broke for a shift change late in the morning, Reed walked carefully through what remained of the foundation, picking through debris for anything recoverable. June's childhood drawings in their tin box. The ceramic tile Audrey had salvaged from a demolished schoolhouse upstate. The small framed photograph that had sat on the kitchen windowsill before June was born. He found most of those things broken. What he did not expect to find was a sealed iron safe the size of a shoebox, still lodged in a cavity beneath the basement slab where the concrete had cracked around, but not through it, just large enough to survive intact what the rest of the floor had not. The safe had a 4-digit combination lock. Inside was a padded envelope sealed with packing tape, and beneath the envelope, a flat silver storage drive no larger than a thumb. The envelope was addressed in Audrey's handwriting, the careful, slanted script she used when she wanted to be precise, and the note inside contained 2 lines. A phone number and a sentence that read, in full, that if anyone had come for the house, Reed should call Mara Ellison before signing anything else, and that the drive would explain everything Audrey had not had time to tell him while she was still alive. Reed read it 3 times, found Mara's number in his own contacts where it had apparently been sitting for years, and called it without setting the paper down. Mara had known Audrey Calloway's name before she knew Reed's face. Several years before the Crown Harbor announcement, Audrey had contacted Mara's office while working as a real estate title examiner, flagging a cluster of property transfers in the Briar Road district that she had found difficult to reconcile with the records they were supposed to support. Mara had left a position at a major regional firm after discovering that a land acquisition team she had advised was using disclosure documents in ways she had not been told about and could not in good conscience defend, and she had filed Audrey's contact information under a category she thought of privately as work left unfinished. When Reed arrived at her office with the envelope and the drive, she recognized the handwriting without being told whose it was. The storage drive contained documentation Audrey had assembled across approximately 18 months of independent review, compiled during the period when she was well enough to work but already aware that the illness might not allow her to finish what she had started. She had recorded the names and transfer dates of 31 residential parcels across the Briar Road district, each of which had passed through one of 3 limited liability companies: Harbor Renewal LLC, Meridian Civic Partners, and Crown Access Holdings, before being consolidated under a holding entity whose registered address corresponded to a building owned by Blackwell Dominion. In each case, the former homeowner had signed some document, a repair authorization, a relocation form, a safety inspection consent, and in each case that signature had migrated, attached to new pages, into a deed transfer the owner had never intended to execute. Audrey had photographed the before and after versions for 11 of the 31 properties where she could obtain both. Reed and Mara spent the following day finding several of the families on Audrey's list. An elderly woman named Harriet, who had lived on Briar Row for 37 years, said she had signed a form from a city contractor authorizing a roof inspection after a windstorm, and later received a certified letter informing her that her property had been transferred to Harbor Renewal LLC. A retired schoolteacher named Douglas said he had signed what he was told was a temporary relocation voucher after a flood assessment and never received the payment the document described. A former shop owner named Patricia said the man who brought her the papers told her the forms were needed for a historic district preservation review. Not one of them had received anything close to market value, and not one of them had understood at the time of signing that they were transferring ownership of anything at all. Cole Branson had run demolition and site clearing work across the county for more than a decade, and he knew the Crown Harbor work had moved faster than anything he had been on before. He appeared at Reed's truck in a parking structure near the waterfront shortly before noon of the second day, introduced himself as the foreman who had run the Briar Row site, and said he had something to say that he had been trying to decide whether to say for several weeks. Cole told them the demolition order on Reed's property had come through at 11 the previous night with instructions to begin no later than 5 in the morning, and that Gavin Lockridge had called his personal cell at 10:45 to say the foundation work, specifically the basement slab, needed to be cleared and turned before the city's inspection team arrived at 8. Cole had saved the voicemail, played it once while looking at the ground, and the voice on the recording said without hesitation to take out the foundation first and leave nothing for the inspection to find. Before Cole could continue, a black sedan pulled into the row behind the truck, and a man in a dark jacket stepped out, holding an envelope Cole recognized as coming from Blackwell's legal department. Reed watched Cole's expression change from resolve to something closer to fear, and watched him walk back to his own vehicle without turning around. When Reed returned to the driver's side, a woman was leaning against the passenger door with her hands in her coat pockets. She said her name was Naomi Archer, that she worked for the federal government, and that she had been watching Blackwell Dominion for 14 months. Naomi Archer was not the kind of agent who led with reassurances, and she did not offer Reed sympathy. She told him, standing in the parking structure with water dripping from the level above, that Crown Harbor was not sufficiently capitalized to proceed on its announced terms, and that Dorian Blackwell was scheduled to sign the final drawdown agreement for a $1.2 billion loan the following morning. A loan conditioned on his certified confirmation that Blackwell Dominion held lawful title to 100% of the project's footprint. That certification could not be made honestly while the transfer of Reed's property remained legally contestable, which meant the man with the worn truck and the carpenter's hands was the only thing standing between Dorian Blackwell and a billion-dollar wire transfer. Naomi said the federal government was aware of fraudulent activity within Blackwell Dominion's acquisition apparatus, but had not yet been able to establish a direct evidentiary link between Dorian himself and the mechanism of the fraud. Every instruction, every authorization, every signed document pointed to Gavin Lockridge and those who reported to him, with Dorian's name appearing nowhere in the visible chain. The parcel Reed had lost was not incidental to the project's design. Parcel 47, the county designation for the Callaway lot, occupied the precise location of the development's primary access corridor, its main drainage channel, and the vehicular spine connecting the hotel tower to the marina entrance. Without that parcel, the project's permitted site plan could not be executed. The foundation layout would require complete regulatory renegotiation, and the loan's collateral structure would need to be rebuilt from the beginning. Blackwell's attorneys had been aware of this vulnerability since the original site plan was approved, and the acquisition of Parcel 47 had been described in internal planning documents as a prerequisite for funding certification. What those documents said, and who had authorized that language, was something Naomi's team had spent more than a year attempting to establish. Mara had spent the previous evening working through the metadata embedded in the digital deed transfer that Blackwell's legal team had filed with the county, and she found something the filing team had apparently not thought to check. The document had been created on a server located on the 71st floor of Blackwell Tower, and a deleted revision note, partially recovered from the document's editing history, read that Parcel 47 must be cleared before funding certification. The account identifier attached to the deletion matched an executive access code assigned exclusively to Dorian Blackwell's administrative profile, and the timestamp on the deletion preceded the demolition of the Calloway house by 9 hours. When Naomi saw the recovered note, she looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Blackwell's public statement that afternoon described the executive account as having been accessed without authorization by a lower-level employee, a claim Naomi acknowledged could not be easily disproved without additional corroborating material. The construction crew was scheduled to pour concrete over the remains of the Calloway Foundation that night, a step that would eliminate the physical boundary markers embedded in the original lot survey and make any subsequent challenge to the site boundary substantially harder to prosecute. Mara contacted the county courthouse and filed an emergency preservation request covering the demolition site, citing the disputed transaction and the pending legal challenge to the transfer. The duty judge reviewed the filing and granted a 4-hour window for physical inspection of the site, beginning at 10 that evening. Naomi told Reed plainly that if anything buried under that foundation disappeared before morning, Dorian Blackwell's legal team would spend the next 2 years converting a federal fraud case into an administrative paperwork dispute, and the 31 families on Audrey's list would almost certainly receive nothing. Reed drove to the site with Mara as the streetlights came on over the empty lots of what had once been a neighborhood. The foundation was lit by portable work lamps borrowed from a restoration job Reed had been running the previous week, casting flat white light across the broken slab and the overturned earth where the basement had been exposed during demolition. Reed worked methodically, the way he always worked, not rushing, not missing anything, reading the site the way he had trained himself to read structures, looking for what was still solid in what appeared destroyed. Near the north wall, he found a cast iron boundary marker, a small conical stake stamped with the county survey code for Parcel 47, still driven at its original depth and entirely undisturbed by the demolition work despite the cleared earth around it. In the debris near the electrical panel housing, he found a compact security recorder, cracked along one edge but structurally intact, still retaining internal log data even though the camera footage had been overwritten, and those logs recorded machine presence at 5:14 in the morning, 2 hours before the county deed transfer would be time-stamped as recorded. Mara examined the boundary marker against the site plan attached to Blackwell's loan application and found a discrepancy that grew more significant the longer she studied it. The survey map filed with the lending institution placed the eastern property line of Parcel 47 at a position that absorbed roughly 8 feet of what the county's own benchmark records showed as belonging to the Calloway lot, and the actual stake, still in the ground under the demolished debris, was 8 feet further east than the filed map claimed it to be. That 8-foot strip ran directly beneath the planned main entrance corridor of Crown Harbor, meaning that without lawful title to that strip, The development's primary entrance point sat on land that still legally belonged to Reed Calloway. Mara photographed everything twice and sent the images to a colleague for independent review before saying a word about what she had found. Cole Branson returned to the site just before midnight, walking in from the unlit end of the block. He had the original voicemail stored on two devices, his work phone and a backup drive he kept at home, and he was prepared to surrender both in exchange for a formal understanding that his cooperation would be taken into account. He told Reed he had spent the past day trying to decide whether the people who had given him work for 12 years deserved more loyalty than the man whose house he had demolished on their instructions, and that the decision had not been as difficult as he expected once he let himself actually make it. He handed over the backup drive without ceremony. Dorian called Reed's cell at 12:48 in the morning. The call lasted 9 minutes. Dorian's opening position was a transfer of $10 million into an account in Reed's name, a completed residence in a neighborhood of his choosing, and the full cost of June's remaining tuition, in exchange for a signed statement confirming that the original transaction had been voluntary, and that Reed's current challenge was a dispute over price rather than over legitimacy. Reed sat in the cab of his truck with Naomi listening on a secondary line and asked quietly whether 10 million was the figure at which a house became dispensable, or whether Dorian had a different number in mind. Dorian increased the offer to 20 million. Reed asked him why a house worth $1 required 20 million to make disappear, and the line was quiet for a moment, before Dorian said the value was not in the structure, but in the certainty that what Blackwell Dominion had built would not be pulled apart by paperwork. Reed said he would think about it and asked to meet in person. Dorian agreed without hesitation and named the floor. Naomi spoke to Reed for 3 minutes after the call ended. She said she could have the building wired, that nothing Reed said would be recorded without his knowledge, and that the only evidence capable of establishing Dorian's personal awareness of the fraud was a statement made by Dorian himself, in a setting where he had no reason to believe he was being monitored. Blackwell Tower was exactly the kind of building Reed spent his career restoring in smaller versions: original structural steel, pre-war detailing in the elevator lobbies, travertine that had been polished too many times and was beginning to look like something other than itself. He took note of these things because he could not help it, the same way he could not walk into a room without reading the load-bearing walls. The 71st floor reception area was paneled in dark wood and glass, the city visible through floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Crown Harbor's construction fence and equipment yards visible below as a geometric arrangement of fencing and machinery that from this height looked like a model of itself. Dorian Blackwell received him in the main conference room with Gavin Lockridge seated to his left and 2 attorneys to his right, and offered coffee, as if the meeting were a routine business development conversation between equals who both happened to be present by choice. Dorian was at his most effective in settings like this one, where the architecture, the altitude, and the composition of the room were all working in the same direction. He showed Reed a rendering of a completed residence, 4 bedrooms, a workshop attached to the garage, designed with what Dorian described as the aesthetic sensibility of a craftsman in mind. He slid a 1-page summary across the table showing the trust structure for the $20 million offer and explained, in language that was precise without being condescending, that the funds would be accessible and protected regardless of the outcome of any legal proceedings against any other party. He said that June's placement, should she want it, had already been coordinated with a firm whose principals had received national recognition for the quality of their restoration practice. He was, in every visible way, a man who expected to be heard. Reed asked about the 31 families. He placed the number on the table without preface and waited. Dorian said each of those families had entered into documented agreements that reflected their decisions at the time. Reed said the documents they signed were repair authorizations and relocation forms, not deeds, and Dorian looked at him for a moment before responding that the people who signed those documents signed what was placed in front of them, and that his organization's responsibility was to ensure the project advanced. Reed asked whether the demolition of his house had been ordered before he signed anything. Dorian said the project timeline had required certainty about that parcel before the financing structure could be closed. Reed asked whether the decision to clear the parcel had been made before any agreement with him existed, and Dorian set down his glass and said, with the particular flatness of a man who had stopped performing patience, that the house had ceased to be a variable the moment he chose the location for the entrance gate. Gavin had been watching Reed's right hand since he sat down, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, resting near the collar of his shirt, settling at the edge of the table, and he leaned toward Dorian and said something low. 2 members of the building's security team entered from the side door. Reed looked at the attorneys and said that complete copies of every document he and Mara Ellison had assembled had already been transmitted to 4 separate secure locations, and that the originals were in the physical possession of a federal attorney not employed by any party in the room. The security team checked Reed's jacket, his sleeves, and the underside of the table and found nothing. Because the recording device was attached to the interior frame of his belt clasp, positioned by Naomi's technical team that afternoon, and no one in the room thought to look there. Reed thanked Dorian for his time and left the building without being stopped. Dorian stood at the window after Reed walked out and looked down at the construction fence for a long time. Then he turned to Gavin and said to move the loan signing to 7 in the morning and to make sure the acquisition servers were cleared before sunrise. The drive Audrey had sealed in the foundations, safe used a file encryption standard from several years prior, and the password had not been written anywhere Reed could find among her belongings. He tried their wedding date, June's birthday, the year the house was built, the address of the first apartment Audrey had ever rented, and the name of the street where she had grown up. None of them worked. He sat in Mara's office at 2 in the morning, the drive connected to a laptop, a blank password field waiting, and called June's number. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she had not been sleeping. He told her briefly that he had found something her mother had left hidden in the foundation and needed to know if Audrey had used a particular phrase as a private reference for the house. Something specific, something she would not have forgotten. June was quiet for several seconds and then said that their mother had always called the house by the same name whenever she wrote about it in letters or in the margins of the books she kept in the front room. She called it the place we chose. Reed typed the phrase with capital letters on the first letter of each word, and the drive unlocked. Inside were 6 organized folders. The first contained scanned copies of the 31 property transactions Audrey had flagged, each accompanied by the original document the homeowner had been given to sign and the deed transfer that had subsequently appeared in the county record. The second folder held a corporate registry cross-reference showing that Harbor Renewal LLC, Meridian Civic Partners, and Crown Access Holdings all shared a registered agent address corresponding to a building managed by Blackwell Dominion at the time of each incorporation. The third folder contained a chain of emails, Audrey's original queries to the compliance department at Blackwell Dominion, sent over the course of several months, detailing the anomalies she had found and requesting clarification. The fourth folder contained the responses. The final email in the response chain had been sent from an account belonging to Dorian Blackwell's executive assistant and contained a single line of substantive content: that Mr. Blackwell had reviewed the exposure described in the attached materials and that the acquisition team was authorized to proceed with an accelerated timeline on all remaining parcels. The date on the email was 4 years prior to the current investigation, and the phrase accelerated acquisition had been used in the same internal document language that Naomi's team had already flagged in separate server records obtained through earlier legal process. When Naomi arrived at Mara's office within 20 minutes of the drive being unlocked, she looked at the email and said that for 14 months she had been unable to establish that Dorian Blackwell had personally reviewed documentation identifying the fraudulent nature of the transfers, and that this email was that documentation. Mara cross-referenced the bank submissions filed by Blackwell Dominion's financing team against the actual status of the acquisitions at the time of each submission, and found that in 12 separate filings sent to federally insured lending institutions over the preceding 2 years, Blackwell Dominion had represented that all homeowners in the Crown Harbor footprint had entered into voluntary transactions at agreed-upon market prices. The representations were made in signed certification documents. The certifications were false. Each wire transfer associated with those submissions had crossed state lines, which meant each one constituted a separate predicate act under federal statute. Naomi told Reed she would take the warrant application to a federal magistrate first thing in the morning, but that a judge would require an overt fraudulent act committed after the application was filed. Not only historical documents that could be characterized as subject to good faith dispute, the loan signing scheduled for 7 in the morning, at which Dorian Blackwell would personally certify complete and lawful ownership of Crown Harbor's entire footprint, would be that act. By midnight, Mara had received word that Wesley Hargrove was at his City Hall office with the lights on, feeding paper into a shredder. The event on the 71st floor of Blackwell Tower began at 6:30 with a continental breakfast for lending representatives, city officials, and a curated group of journalists who had followed Crown Harbor's development since the initial announcement. Dorian stood at the center of the room in a charcoal suit and accepted congratulations with the unhurried ease of a man who had constructed the outcome he was celebrating across many years of deliberate work. The scale model of the finished development occupied the center of the room, Crown Harbor in completed form, the marina rendered in halogen light, the towers cast in bronze-tinted acrylic, the entrance corridor flowing cleanly toward a waterfront promenade that would not exist for another 7 years if it existed at all. The loan representatives reviewed the certification package while associates circulated coffee, and the room had the atmosphere of an outcome already secured. Outside, on the sidewalk in front of Blackwell Tower and along 2 adjacent blocks, Reed stood with 23 of the 31 families from Audrey's list. Mara stood beside him at a portable podium and presented the assembled press with a summary of what had been documented: the page substitutions, the stolen notary seal, the demolition timestamps preceding the recorded transfers, the shell company ownership chain, and the email in which Dorian Blackwell's office had authorized accelerated acquisition after being informed that the acquisition process was legally problematic. The journalists who had covered Crown Harbor as an aspirational civic story found themselves holding documentation that described a different kind of story, and several of them began making calls before the presentation concluded. Cole Branson arrived on foot from the far end of the block, introduced himself to the nearest camera without preamble, and played the voicemail from Gavin Lockridge directing him to clear the foundation before the city inspection team arrived. Wesley Hargrove had loaded 4 file boxes into the trunk of his personal vehicle at 6:14 in the morning, according to the parking structure's access log. 2 federal vehicles intercepted him on the bridge connecting the Civic District to the highway at 6:40, and the agents recovered the boxes intact. Inside were payment ledgers, consulting contracts describing no actual services, and wire transfer records showing regular payments from a Blackwell Dominion subsidiary to an account held in Wesley's personal name across 4 years. On the 71st floor, Gavin appeared at Dorian's elbow at 6:58 and said 2 words. Dorian looked at him and then looked at the window, at the cluster of people visible on the sidewalk below, too far away to identify, close enough to understand. He asked Gavin how far along the legal team's response was, and Gavin told him there was no response that could be ready before the signing. Dorian straightened his jacket, picked up the certification package, and signed his name on the confirmation line identifying Blackwell Dominion Group as the sole lawful owner of the entirety of Crown Harbor's development footprint. The electronic transfer of the first tranche, $240 million, was initiated through the federal wire system at 7:03 in the morning. Naomi's phone registered the transaction notification at 7:04. She was standing in a courthouse hallway while a federal magistrate initialed the bottom of the search warrant and the arrest order. She folded both documents into her jacket and walked toward the elevator with the particular unhurried stride of someone who had been waiting 14 months to take the next step. The building's private elevator bank locked at 7:22, 70 floors of express travel, suspended by a federal access hold the tower's security system was legally required to comply with. The lobby doors opened at 7:23. 41 agents entered in 3 teams, one to the executive floors, one to the server room on the 44th floor, one to the in-house legal department on floor 32. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no physical resistance of any kind. The towers of paperwork and the hum of the building's data infrastructure continued without interruption, which made the whole thing stranger rather than less grave. The ordinary machinery of a functioning enterprise being methodically placed under federal control, while the people who worked there stood in hallways and said nothing. Gavin moved to the server room on his own initiative before the FBI team arrived on the executive floor, accessed the acquisition database through his personal credentials, and entered an administrative deletion sequence for the land acquisition files. The technical team had secured a preservation order covering those servers 48 hours earlier and had already mirrored the drives at the data center level. The deletion command registered, executed on the surface layer, and changed nothing about what was held in the preserved copy. Gavin stood with his hand on the keyboard, and did not know for approximately 4 minutes that the files existed exactly as they had before he touched the terminal. When the agents came through the door, he understood. The physical evidence recovered from the executive offices included signature page templates printed on stock different from the document bodies they had been attached to, notary seals matching the reported lost codes of 4 public officials across 3 states, a binder containing handwritten notes on the acquisition timeline for each of the 31 parcels on Audrey's list, and a set of internal communications that had not appeared in any prior document production provided to federal investigators under subpoena. From the legal department on floor 32, agents recovered engagement files from the law firms hired to manage the shell company registrations, and a set of written opinion letters confirming those firms' expressed view that the transfer documentation being generated by Gavin's team was legally deficient, letters received by Dorian's office and never acted upon. Dorian told the agents in the conference room on the 69th floor that Gavin Lockridge had operated the acquisition department autonomously and that he had no knowledge of the specific mechanisms used in Briar Row. He said it the way a person says something they have prepared to say. Naomi said a printed transcript of the recording Reed had made on the floor above and invited him to explain his statements about the parcel's timeline in light of the email his office had sent to Audrey Calloway 4 years prior. Gavin moved to a separate room at the same time, asked for his attorney, and then, after a 40-minute wait, told the agents sitting with him that he had operational documentation in a physical key lock cabinet in his 71st floor office and that he was prepared to make it available. Wesley Hargrove, from the field office interview room where he had been taken after the bridge stop, confirmed that his signature appeared on every emergency demolition permit issued in the Crown Harbor footprint across the preceding 3 years, and that none of those permits had been issued on his own initiative. Naomi read the formal charges to Dorian from a printed sheet: conspiracy to commit fraud, bank fraud, bribery of a public official, unlawful transfer of real property, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Dorian was escorted from Blackwell Tower through the main lobby and into a vehicle on the street, while a cluster of cameras positioned to cover the loan signing announcement turned to follow him instead. He looked at Reed once, briefly from the bottom of the steps, and said that he had built this city. Reed looked back at him and said that what Dorian had built was a structure raised on the assumption that the people he displaced would never find their footing again. Outside the enormous digital display wrapping the lower floors of Blackwell Tower, the animated rendering of Crown Harbor, complete, glittering perpetually at sunrise, flickered once and went dark, leaving nothing visible but the bare steel scaffolding frame it had been mounted on. The federal indictment named Dorian Blackwell, Gavin Lockridge, and Wesley Hargrove on a total of 14 counts. Blackwell Dominion Group was placed under the supervision of an independent compliance monitor pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, and the $1.2 billion loan facility was suspended at the bank's request within 48 hours of the arrest. Crown Harbor was formally halted pending a complete audit of every property transfer in the project's footprint, all 31 residential parcels, the commercial acquisitions, and the infrastructure easements. And the county's Register of Deeds began the process of reviewing which transfers had been lawfully executed and which had not. The audit took 8 months. When it concluded, 29 of the 31 families were found to have signed documents that did not legally constitute deeds, and their titles were restored along with compensation for losses incurred during the period of wrongful dispossession. The remaining two had sold willingly at inadequate prices and received payments reflecting the difference between what they had accepted and what the market had actually supported at the time of each transaction. Reed never asked for the project to be stopped. He understood what development did to a city, how it could either hollow out a neighborhood or, done with accountability, build something worth having. He filed a formal objection to the project's original site plan, not to halt Crown Harbor but to require that Parcel 47 be incorporated into the final design on terms that reflected its actual location and legal status. After 14 months of negotiation, which Mara handled from a conference table in her community office, while the Blackwell Dominion successor team worked from their attorneys' offices across town, a revised site plan was approved. The main entrance corridor was redesigned around the actual lot boundary. A portion of the development's residential component was reclassified as workforce housing. A legal support fund was established under the settlement agreement to provide property owners facing contested transfers with access to counsel at no cost, funded through a fixed percentage of Crown Harbor's future revenue, and an independent title review board was created with authority to audit future acquisition activity within the city. Reed used the compensation allocated to Parcel 47 to rebuild. He did not try to reproduce what had stood there before. That would have been its own kind of dishonesty, pretending the break had not happened. He salvaged the front door frame, which had survived by falling inward and being protected by the basement slab, and set it into the new structure at the original position on the original foundation line. He kept two sections of the exterior brick wall, incorporated into the interior as a feature that announced the building's age without concealing the interruption between what had been and what was now. He kept the iron safe, cleaned and refinished, mounted on the wall of the new front room as an object, without pretense about what it was and what it had held. June came back at the end of her semester, looked at the drawings her father had made, and told him she thought he was approaching it wrong, that the goal was not to restore what had been lost, but to continue from what remained, the way her mother had always continued from what was available rather than mourning what was not. She revised the drawings herself, and what resulted was not quite the house that had stood there before and not quite a new house, but something that acknowledged both without being diminished by either. Mara delivered the restored title documents on the day the framing was completed and accepted Reed's invitation to dinner when the house was ready to be lived in. And she said yes in the same measured way she said most things, without surplus and without hesitation. 1 year after the arrest, Reed stood at the front of the new structure and looked at Crown Harbor's revised construction fence, still unbroken, the first tower of what had been a billion-dollar certainty still unbuilt. On the wall beside the front door, framed in oak he had milled himself, hung the forged deed transferring Parcel 47 for a consideration of $1 below it on a small plate cast in the same iron as the boundary marker Mara had photographed in the rubble. 4 words had been set into the frame. This home was never for sale. The house behind it had been reduced to dust and rebuilt from its own bones, and it was still standing.